Tonight, we are going to look at 10 true stories about people who appear out of nowhere and the thin, invisible lines that separate a normal day from a total mystery. These cases range from the high-altitude skies of the Pacific Northwest to the ancient salt deserts of Iran, and they all share a common thread of things left behind. This episode is designed to pair with the sound of rain falling outside to help you drift off to sleep. Before we begin, I would love for you to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting me know what city or town you are listening from tonight. I hope you have already double-checked the locks on your front doors tonight. Just to be sure, you should also reach out and hit that like button as gently as you would adjust a seatbelt before takeoff. It is a small gesture, but it helps the channel grow and keeps the lights on while we explore these darker corners of history. Now, let's get into the first story. Imagine a man who decides to buy the entire sky for $20. He does not want the clouds or the stars, and he certainly does not want to keep the ground. He simply wants to exist in the space between two cities for just long enough to vanish. This is the story of a man who turned a routine 40-minute flight into the greatest vanishing act in the history of American aviation. On November 24th, 1971, the Portland International Airport was crowded with people heading home for Thanksgiving. Among them was a man who looked like any other mid-level executive in a mid-sized city. He wore a dark suit, a white shirt, and a black clip-on tie that matched his sensible shoes. He walked to the Northwest Orient counter and paid $20 in cash for a one-way ticket to Seattle. Florence Schaffner was a 23-year-old flight attendant who had seen thousands of men just like him. She was working Flight 305, a short hop that usually felt more like a bus ride than a journey. As the Boeing 727 began its taxi toward the runway, she noticed the man in seat 18C. He was sitting quietly, sipping a bourbon and water while smoking a Raleigh cigarette. The takeoff was smooth, and the cabin settled into the white noise of the engines. Florence moved through the aisle, checking on the 36 passengers as the plane climbed into the gray, rainy sky. The man in 18C was not doing anything unusual, but he seemed settled in a way that most travelers were not. He did not have a bag in the overhead bin, only a small black briefcase sitting at his feet. Florence felt the weight of a long holiday shift ahead of her as she moved past the man's row. She was thinking about the coffee she would have once they landed in Seattle and the family she would see the next day. The man reached out and handed her a small folded slip of paper. Florence took it with a practiced smile, assuming it was just another lonely businessman leaving his phone number for her to find later. She dropped the note into her purse without looking at it and continued her walk toward the back of the plane. The man watched her for a moment and then leaned slightly into the aisle. He did not raise his voice, but there was a specific, heavy quality to his tone that cut through the engine hum. He told her she should look at the note because he had a bomb in his briefcase. Florence stopped walking and reached back into her purse to pull out the paper. The handwriting was neat and all in capital letters, stating that he had a bomb and wanted her to sit beside him. She turned back and saw that he was still sitting perfectly still, his eyes hidden behind a pair of dark sunglasses. She walked back to his row and sat down in the empty seat next to him. The man clicked open the briefcase just enough for Florence to see inside. She saw 8 red cylinders attached to a tangle of red and white wires, all connected to a large silver battery. The sight was mechanical and precise, lacking any of the messy details she might have expected. He closed the case with a soft click and began to list his demands in a calm, steady voice. He wanted $200,000 in negotiable American currency and 4 parachutes. He also demanded a fuel truck be standing by in Seattle to refuel the plane as soon as it touched down. Florence listened carefully, memorizing the details while the man remained polite and composed. He told her to go to the cockpit and tell the pilot what he had said, and she stood up to follow his instructions. Captain William Scott received the message over the internal phone and immediately contacted air traffic control. The plane began to circle the Seattle-Tacoma area, while authorities on the ground scrambled to gather the cash and the parachutes. The passengers were told there was a minor mechanical delay, and most of them went back to their magazines or naps. They had no idea there was a live explosive sitting in 18C. For 2 hours, the plane looped through the rain clouds while the man in the suit sat and waited. He did not show signs of nervousness or agitation, and he even offered to pay for the drinks Florence brought him. He seemed to have an intimate knowledge of the local terrain, pointing out landmarks through the window despite the heavy cloud cover. He was a man who knew exactly where he was at all times. When the word finally came that the money and parachutes were ready, the plane landed at the Seattle airport. The man ordered the pilots to taxi to a remote, brightly lit section of the runway. He kept the window shades pulled down and ordered the lights in the cabin to be dimmed. He was careful to stay out of the line of sight of any snipers who might be positioned in the terminal buildings. The exchange was handled through a single door. The $200,000, packed into a heavy canvas bag, was handed over along with the 4 parachutes. Once the man confirmed the items were on board, he allowed all 36 passengers and Florence to leave the plane. He kept only the flight crew and 1 other flight attendant as hostages for the next leg of his journey. The man gave the pilots very specific instructions for the flight toward Mexico City. He wanted the plane to fly at an altitude of no more than 10,000 feet, which was unusually low for a jet. He also demanded the landing gear remain down and the wing flaps be set at 15 degrees to keep the speed slow. Finally, he insisted that the cabin remain unpressurized throughout the entire flight. Captain Scott tried to explain that these settings would make the flight difficult and use a massive amount of fuel. The man simply nodded and told him that he understood the mechanics of the Boeing 727. He knew that this specific model was one of the few jets that could safely fly with its rear stairs lowered during flight. He had studied the machine he was currently holding hostage. As the plane took off again into a fierce thunderstorm, the man ordered the remaining flight attendant into the cockpit. He was now alone in the main cabin with his briefcase, his money, and his parachutes. The rain lashed against the fuselage, and the wind began to howl as the jet struggled through the turbulent air at a low altitude. The crew sat in the cockpit, watching the instrument panel for any sign of movement. Suddenly, a warning light flashed on the dashboard, indicating that the rear air stair had been deployed. The pilots felt a sharp change in air pressure that made their ears pop as the interior of the plane was open to the night. Cold, wet air rushed through the cabin with a roar that sounded like a freight train. The man was standing on the edge of the open stairs, looking out into the blackness. The plane was passing over a rugged, heavily forested area near the Lewis River in Washington state. The temperature outside was well below freezing, and the rain was turning into a blinding sleet. Without a word or a hesitation, the man stepped off the platform and into the void. He disappeared instantly, swallowed by the darkness and the storm at 10,000 feet. When the plane finally landed in Reno, Nevada, for its scheduled refueling, police and FBI agents swarmed the cabin. They found the rear stairs still hanging down, swaying slightly in the wind. The main cabin was completely empty of people, but they found a few items left behind. On seat 18C, there was a black clip-on tie and a mother-of-pearl tie clip. The investigators also found 66 unidentified fingerprints and the 2 Raleigh cigarette butts the man had smoked. They launched one of the most extensive manhunts in the history of the Northwest, searching thousands of acres of dense forest and freezing rivers. They found nothing. No body, no parachute, and no sign of the $200,000 that had vanished into the rainy night. In 1980, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was digging in the sand along the Columbia River. He uncovered 3 bundles of cash that had been badly degraded by the water and the weather. The serial numbers matched the ransom money given to the hijacker nearly a decade earlier. The find proved the money had made it to the ground, but it did not explain what happened to the man. The FBI investigated over 800 suspects during the following decades, but each one was eventually cleared. The man had used the alias Dan Cooper, which the press later mistakenly turned into D.B. Cooper. He became a folk hero to some and a ghost to others. He was a professional who had planned every detail except, perhaps, the exact spot where he would eventually land. In 2016, The FBI officially closed the active investigation, citing a lack of new evidence. However, the mystery did not end there. In 2026, citizen sleuths and scientists have used advanced particle analysis on the tie left behind in the cabin. They found rare fragments of titanium and bismuth that were only used in high-end aerospace manufacturing plants during the late 1960s. These findings suggest that the man was not just a random criminal, but likely a specialized contractor who worked in a Boeing-related facility. Despite the new clues, his real name remains a void in the historical record. He remains the only person in the history of commercial aviation to successfully hijack a plane and vanish without a trace. He is a man who walked into the sky and stayed there. 1971 was a year of grand, cinematic mysteries, but as the search for the man in the suit cooled, the world's attention began to shift toward a different kind of predator. Just 6 years later, in a different state, a family was about to sit down for dinner, unaware that the distance between a safe home and a dark basement was about to vanish. On a warm July night in 1971, a woman named Mary was asleep in her home in St. Helier. The island of Jersey was a place where the air always smelled like salt, and the wind was usually the only thing moving after midnight. She woke up to a sound that did not belong in the darkness of her bedroom. It was a rhythmic, metallic scratching against the glass of her second-story window. Mary lay perfectly still, listening to the sound while the rest of the house remained silent. She lived in a community where people rarely bothered to turn a key in a lock because the ocean acted as their primary security. Everyone on the island knew their neighbors, and crime was something that happened in the news reports from London. The scratching stopped, followed by the heavy, muffled thud of someone landing on the grass outside. The island of Jersey is a small crown dependency sitting in the English Channel, just off the coast of France. In the late 1960s, it was a place of rolling green hills, quiet lanes, and a very slow pace of life. Families lived in the same stone cottages for generations, and the local economy was built on tourism and farming. It was a world that felt insulated from the chaos of the outside world. During this time, the residents of Jersey took great pride in their sense of community and safety. Children played in the fields until the sun went down, and the local police spent most of their time dealing with minor traffic issues. There was a deep, unspoken trust that everyone on the island shared. This trust was the foundation of their daily lives, and it was something they never expected to lose. Edward Paisnell was a man who fit perfectly into this quiet landscape. He was 56 years old, married, and lived in a modest home with his wife, Joanne. Neighbors saw him as a bit of an eccentric, but he was generally well-liked and involved in the community. He had a steady job and a routine that never seemed to vary from day to day. Edward spent much of his free time attending local events, and even had the chance to stand in a welcoming line for the Queen during a royal visit. He was the kind of man who would wave to his neighbors and offer a polite word about the weather. People saw him as a harmless, middle-aged man who was a permanent fixture in St. Helier. He was a face that belonged on the island. However, for over 11 years, a dark shadow had been moving through the lanes of Jersey after the sun went down. The local newspapers had given this shadow a name that made people look over their shoulders: the Beast of Jersey. The Beast did not just commit crimes, he terrorized the population with a theatrical, calculated brand of horror. He seemed to appear out of thin air and vanish just as quickly. The attacks followed a chillingly consistent pattern that left the local police completely baffled. A figure would break into a home or snatch a person from a dark lane, always wearing a disguise that seemed designed to cause maximum psychological damage. He did not care about money or jewelry. He wanted the fear that came from being hunted in a place that was supposed to be safe. As the years passed, the legend of the Beast grew into a collective nightmare for the people of Jersey. Locksmiths became the busiest businessmen on the island as residents began to secure their doors for the first time in history. The once quiet night air was now filled with the sound of barking dogs and heavy bolts sliding into place. The island was no longer a sanctuary, it was a hunting ground. The first off-note detail that began to change the investigation was the description of the beast's face. Survivors did not describe a human man, but rather a monster with a frozen, terrifying expression. They spoke of a rubber mask with long, matted hair and rows of sharp nails driven through the jawline. The image was so grotesque that many people believed the attacker was part of an occult group. This mask became the central anchor of the island's fear. It was not a mask you could buy in a shop, but something that had been meticulously handmade for a single purpose. The sight of it in a dark hallway was enough to paralyze a victim before they could even think about screaming. The beast knew this, and he used the mask to control the space around him. Despite the massive police presence and the growing public panic, the beast remained invisible for over a decade. He seemed to have a supernatural knowledge of the island's geography, using forgotten paths and back alleys to evade every dragnet. He was a phantom who knew the pulse of the community better than the officers who were trying to catch him. The pressure on the local authorities was becoming unbearable. On July 17, 1971, a police officer named Mick Kemp was on a routine patrol in the early morning hours. He was watching a quiet intersection when he saw a car run a red light at high speed. It was a minor violation, but the driver's erratic behavior made the officer suspicious. He pulled out behind the vehicle and signaled for it to stop. The car was a stolen vehicle, and the man behind the wheel was Edward Paisnell. He looked tired and slightly disheveled, but he tried to maintain his usual polite demeanor as the officer approached. He gave a fake name and tried to explain that he was just in a hurry to get home. However, Officer Kemp noticed something unusual sitting on the floor of the passenger side. It was a bundle of dark clothing and a heavy, long coat that seemed out of place for a warm summer night. When the officer asked Edward to step out of the car, he noticed that the man was wearing several layers of clothing underneath his suit. The search of the vehicle revealed a collection of items that made the officer's blood run cold. He had found the hunting gear. Edward was taken into custody, and a team of detectives was sent to search his home in St. Helier. They were greeted by his wife, Joanne, who seemed completely confused by the arrival of the police. She allowed them to enter, insisting that her husband was a good man who had never done anything wrong. The detectives began a room-by-room search of the property. In the basement, they found a small, wooden door that was hidden behind a stack of storage boxes. The door was locked with a heavy padlock, and Edward's wife claimed she had never seen the key for it. When the police forced the door open, they stepped into a secret room that looked like a scene from a horror film. The walls were lined with shelves of disturbing items. There was a collection of occult literature, handwritten diaries, and hundreds of photographs of the island's residents. But the most terrifying discovery was sitting on a small table in the center of the room. It was the rubber mask. It looked even more horrific in the light, with its dirty wig and the rusted nails protruding from the rubber skin. The detectives realized they were standing in the heart of the beast's world. The diaries contained detailed logs of every attack, including the routes taken and the reactions of the victims. Edward Paisnell had been living a double life for 11 years. Serving as a polite community member by day and a masked predator by night. He had meticulously documented his own descent into madness. The discovery sent a shockwave through the island of Jersey that would last for generations. People who had known Edward for decades could not reconcile the man who met the Queen with the man who wore the nailed-shut mask. He had exploited their trust and their safety to satisfy a deep-seated need for power and ritualized fear. The monster next door was no longer a metaphor. Edward Paisnell was tried and convicted for his crimes, receiving a 30-year prison sentence. He never showed any remorse for what he had done, maintaining a cold and distant attitude throughout the proceedings. He seemed to view his victims not as people, but as participants in a grand, theatrical performance of his own creation. He was a man who had become his own mask. Edward died in prison in 1994. But the trauma he inflicted on the island did not end with his death. The mask and the secret room became symbols of a lost era of innocence for the people of Jersey. Even in 2026, the case is cited as the most significant event in the island's modern history. It changed the way they looked at their neighbors forever. Today, The island of Jersey is once again a quiet and beautiful place. But the legacy of the beast remains in the way people secure their homes. The trust that was broken in 1971 has never been fully restored. The mask is kept in a secure police facility, a reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a polite smile and a quiet life. From the narrow lanes of a British island, the darkness shifts east, across continents, to a place where the silence is much larger and the ground is made of salt. In the early 70s, the outskirts of Tehran held a different kind of void. It was a landscape where people went looking for a future, only to find that the desert had a way of keeping the things it caught. In the early months of 1973, the air outside Tehran felt like a heavy, heated blanket made of grit and sun. The city was expanding in every direction, pushing its concrete fingers into the ancient, salt-crusted plains that stretched toward the horizon. For the young men arriving from the provinces, the dust was not a nuisance, but the smell of opportunity and a paycheck. They came with nothing but a few rials in their pockets and a hope that the city would have a place for them. One of these men was a 19-year-old named Reza, who had traveled 2 days by bus from a small village in the south. He stood on the edge of a busy construction site, his eyes squinting against the glare of the midday sun. The sounds of jackhammers and shouting men filled the air, creating a chaotic symphony of progress that felt both exciting and overwhelming. Torreza. Every passing truck represented a potential job and a way to send money back to his mother. Reza spent his first few days sleeping in a crowded hostel with 10 other men who shared his same ambition. They would wake up before dawn, wash their faces with cold water, and head out to the dusty edges of the city where the new roads were being carved. The competition for manual labor was fierce, and many men spent their entire day standing in the heat without ever being picked for a shift. It was a life of waiting and watching. The landscape surrounding the capital was a stark contrast to the growing skyline of glass and steel. Just a few miles from the city center, the ground turned into a desolate expanse of salt flats and dry ravines. It was a place where the wind carved strange shapes into the earth, and the sun bleached everything to a pale, bone-white color. Very few people had a reason to wander into the deep desert unless they were looking for something they did not want others to find. Reza was a young man of few words, known among the other laborers for his steady hands and his willingness to work longer hours for less pay. He did not mind the physical toll of carrying heavy bags of cement or digging trenches in the hard, unyielding soil. He was focused on the rhythm of the work and the small pile of coins growing in his pocket. For a boy from the provinces, the city was a machine that required constant fuel, and he was happy to provide it. By the second week of the month, the heat had become even more intense, driving many of the migrant workers into the shade of the half-finished buildings. Reza remained on the roadside, hoping for one last job before the sun went down. He watched the cars and trucks go by, their tires kicking up clouds of fine, white powder that coated his skin and filled his lungs. He felt the pressure of the city, a place that promised everything but offered very little for free. The migration to Tehran in the early 70s was part of a massive shift in the country's economy that left thousands of people in a state of constant transit. Because so many men were moving between the city and the rural areas, it was common for people to disappear for weeks or months at a time. A young man who did not show up for work one morning was usually assumed to have simply found a better job elsewhere or returned to his home village. This constant movement created a background of anonymity that was perfect for anyone who wanted to move through the world without being noticed. The police in Tehran were focused on the political unrest and the growing pains of a modernizing city, and they had little time to track the movements of poor laborers. If a man went missing from a construction site, there was rarely a formal report filed and even less effort put into finding him. Reza found himself walking along a stretch of the salt flats one afternoon, looking for a shortcut back to his hostel. He was tired, and the weight of his tools made every step feel like a chore. The road he was following was little more than a set of tire tracks pressed into the crusty earth. The only sound was the crunch of salt beneath his boots and the distant, low hum of traffic that felt like it belonged to a different world entirely. The silence of the desert was profound, a physical presence that seemed to push against his ears. He looked back toward the city and saw the hazy outline of the Alborz Mountains, their peaks still capped with a thin layer of white snow. It was a beautiful sight, but it felt remarkably far away. He was alone in a space where the horizon never seemed to get any closer, no matter how fast he walked or how hard he tried to reach it. A small pickup truck appeared in the distance, a dark speck against the shimmering heat of the salt flats. It moved slowly, bouncing over the uneven ground as it approached the spot where Reza was standing. The driver was a man who looked like he belonged to the desert, with skin that had been tanned to a deep leather by decades of sun exposure. He slowed the vehicle to a crawl and leaned his head out of the window with a friendly nod. The driver offered Reza a ride, claiming he was heading back toward the city center and had plenty of room in the cab. Reza hesitated for only a second before climbing inside. Grateful for a break from the relentless sun, the interior of the truck smelled of old vinyl, sweat, and the faint, sweet scent of dried fruit. He settled into the worn seat, feeling the vibrations of the engine through the floorboards as the truck began to move again. Beat 1. The cabin was cramped and hot, with the smell of dust and old engine oil clinging to everything. Beat 2. As the truck turned away from the city and began to move deeper into the salt ravines. Reza noticed the driver was not checking the rearview mirror or looking at the road. Beat 3. He thought about how small he must look from the air. A tiny figure in a tiny truck, being carried away from the only life he had ever known. The driver was a man named Hushang Amini, and he spoke in a low, rhythmic voice that was almost hypnotic. He did not ask Reza many questions, instead talking about the beauty of the desert and the hidden places where the salt formed perfect crystals. He seemed to know every turn and every depression in the landscape, moving the truck with a confidence that suggested he had made this journey hundreds of times before. Reza began to feel a strange, heavy sense of unease. They were now miles away from the main road, surrounded by high walls of salt and sand that blocked the view of the city. The driver slowed the truck to a stop in a shallow depression that was hidden from the wind. He turned off the engine, and the sudden silence was more jarring than the roar of the machinery had been. He looked at Reza with a calm, blank expression and reached into the space behind the seat for something heavy. The first off-note detail was not a sound, but a feeling of absolute isolation. Reza realized that if he were to shout, the sound would simply be swallowed by the salt walls and the dry air. The driver's hands were steady as he gripped a heavy iron bar, his eyes showing no anger and no excitement. He moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who was performing a routine task, something as common as digging a hole or pouring a foundation. Reza tried to open the door, but the handle felt stuck, and his own hands were shaking too much to find the latch. The pressure in the cab felt like it was rising, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. He looked at the driver and saw a man who had completely removed himself from the humanity of the moment. There was no conversation left to have and no mercy to be found in the silence of the salt flats. In that moment, the point of no return was reached. The truck was parked in a natural tomb, a place where the earth itself was made of the same minerals used to preserve the dead. The driver stepped out of the vehicle and walked around to the passenger side, his boots making a sharp, rhythmic crunch on the salt crust. He moved without haste, knowing that his target had nowhere to run and no one to call for help. The discovery of what was happening in the desert did not come from the police or the government, but from the desert itself. In late 1973, a young man who had been lured into the salt flats managed to do the impossible. He survived the initial attack and fled into the darkness of a moonless night, using the distant lights of the city as his only guide. He ran until his feet were bleeding and his lungs were burning from the salt dust. He reached a small police outpost on the edge of Tehran, collapsing in the doorway with a story that sounded like a fever dream. He spoke of a man in a truck, a hidden valley of salt, and the bodies of other young men buried in shallow depressions. The officers were skeptical at first, but the sheer terror in the young man's eyes convinced them to investigate the area he had described. They gathered a small team and headed into the waste. When the police reached the salt flats, they found the tire tracks that led away from the main road. They followed them into the hidden ravines, and as they began to dig into the white crust, they were horrified by what they found. Beneath the salt were the remains of dozens of young men, all of them buried in a way that suggested a long and systematic killing spree. The desert was not empty, it was a vast, silent graveyard. The investigation was one of the largest in the history of the country, but it was hampered by the fact that many of the victims could not be identified. They were the unseen men of the city, the laborers and transients who had no one to report them missing. The scale of the crimes was staggering, with estimates eventually reaching over 60 victims. The authorities realized they were dealing with a predator who had exploited the entire social structure of the era. Hushang Amini was eventually tracked down through the description of his truck and the testimony of the lone survivor. When he was arrested, he did not deny what he had done. He spoke about his victims as if they were nothing more than objects he had found in the desert, things that he had the right to discard. He showed no remorse and no understanding of the lives he had extinguished. He was a man who had become part of the barren landscape. The search for the burial sites continued for months, with police uncovering more mounds in the salt flats every week. Each discovery added another layer of horror to a case that had already shocked the nation. The victims were found with their meager possessions still in their pockets: a few rials, a photograph of a family in a distant village, a small tool for work. These items were the only evidence that these men had ever existed. The theory of the case was simple and devastating. Amini had realized that the rapid growth of Tehran created a class of people who were essentially invisible to the law. He targeted the most vulnerable, offering them the one thing they needed most: a way to get ahead. By the time they realized the trap, they were already in the deep desert, far from any eyes that might have seen what was happening to them. The trial of Hushang Amini was swift, and he was sentenced to death shortly after his conviction. The public's reaction was a mix of fury and deep, unsettling shame. People began to realize how easily a person could vanish in the modern world, and how little the system cared about those at the bottom of the ladder. The Beast of Tehran became a symbol of the dark side of progress and the high cost of urbanization. The truth revealed during the final reconstruction of the crimes was that Amini had been active for several years. He had developed a method that allowed him to kill and dispose of a body in less than an hour, leaving almost no physical evidence behind. He used the natural properties of the salt desert to hide his tracks, letting the wind and the shifting sand do the work of concealing his crimes for him. He was executed in 1974, but the graves in the salt flats remained a haunting presence on the edge of the city. For years, people avoided the area, claiming they could hear the voices of the lost men carried on the wind. The case exposed a massive hole in the way the country protected its citizens, leading to a brief period of reform in how missing persons reports were handled for the migrant population. Hushang Amini was a man who understood the power of silence and the utility of a desolate place. He did not need a complicated plan or a high-tech weapon. He only needed a truck and a landscape that nobody wanted to look at. He turned the very ground beneath his feet into an accomplice, using the ancient salt of the earth to bury the future of 60 young men who only wanted a better life. In 2026, the salt flats have been partially overtaken by the expanding suburbs of Tehran. Criminologists still study the case as a primary example of how social and economic shifts can create perfect conditions for a serial predator. The Beast of Tehran is a reminder that even in a city of millions, the most dangerous place to be is in the company of a man who knows a quiet spot in the desert. The desert has a way of staying still, even when the world around it is moving too fast. That was 1973. By the time the final graves were marked in Iran, the silence of the salt flats had been replaced by the rustle of pine needles in a Spanish forest. There, 4 people sat down for a picnic, and the absolute quiet that followed would stay with the city of Melilla for the next 50 years. A truck disappearing into the dust, a set of tire tracks. In our next case, the evidence was much more intimate, a picnic blanket spread out in the shade. It was a Sunday afternoon in a place that should have been the safest square mile on earth. And yet, the only thing the investigators found was the sound of the wind moving through the trees. On a bright Sunday morning in May of 1974, Antonio was loading a wicker basket into the back of his small sedan. The sun was already high over the city of Melilla, casting long shadows across the narrow streets of the Spanish exclave. He hummed a quiet tune to himself, enjoying the rare feeling of a day without work or obligations. His wife, Maria, stood in the doorway with their 2 children, everyone dressed in their Sunday best for a trip to the forest. The city of Melilla felt like a fortress because, in many ways, it was exactly that. It was a tiny patch of Spanish soil on the North African coast, surrounded on 3 sides by Morocco and on the 4th by the Mediterranean Sea. For families like the Chicanos, the border walls were not a source of fear, but a constant reminder of the safety found within their own community. Everyone knew everyone else's business, and the local police force was more like a collection of family friends. Antonio worked as a modest shopkeeper in the center of town, a man known for his fair prices and his predictable schedule. He was 42 years old, with a face that was beginning to show the lines of a lifetime spent under the hot sun. His only real ambition was to provide a stable life for his wife and their 2 young children, Pacu and Elena. To him, a successful week was measured by a full dinner table and a quiet house at night. Maria had spent the previous evening preparing the food for their outing, wrapping fresh fruit and bread in clean linen cloths. She was a woman who took great pride in the small details of her home, from the polish on the floor to the starch in her children's collars. As she stepped into the car, she handed a small bag of sweets to 10-year-old Paco and 8-year-old Elena. The children were buzzing with the kind of energy that only comes from the promise of an afternoon in the woods. The drive to the Rostrogordo pine forest took less than 15 minutes because nothing in Melilla was truly far away. The entire territory covered only about 5 square miles, a cramped and busy space that made the open forest feel like a vast wilderness. Antonio drove slowly through the gates of the city, waving to the soldiers stationed at the checkpoints. They were a common sight, part of the landscape of a city that was always prepared for a threat that never seemed to arrive. As they pulled into the shaded parking area of the forest, the air immediately felt different. The scent of pine needles was heavy and sweet, masking the salty tang of the sea that usually dominated the city air. Antonio found a spot beneath a cluster of ancient trees, far enough away from the other picnickers to feel private, but close enough to hear the distant sounds of other families. It was the kind of perfect Sunday that people in Melilla lived for during the long, hot summers. Maria spread a large, checkered blanket over the soft bed of pine needles while the children ran to a nearby clearing. Antonio sat down and leaned his back against a sturdy trunk, watching his family with a sense of quiet satisfaction. He began to peel an orange, the sharp citrus scent cutting through the warm, still air. There were other groups scattered throughout the woods, their voices carrying on the breeze like a soft, indistinct murmur. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the heat had reached its peak, and the forest had fallen into a heavy, midday lull. Antonio noticed that the earlier sounds of laughter and conversation had faded as most families settled in for a nap or a quiet meal. He looked over at Maria, who was cutting a piece of cheese for Elena, her movements slow and deliberate. The world felt static, like a photograph that had been left out in the sun for too long. The first off-note detail was a subtle shift in the environment that Antonio could not quite name at first. He realized that the constant, high-pitched buzzing of the cicadas had suddenly stopped, leaving a void in the air that felt unnaturally heavy. He paused with a piece of fruit halfway to his mouth, his head tilted as he listened for the sound of his children playing. But Paco and Elena were sitting perfectly still on the edge of the blanket, their eyes fixed on a dense patch of shadows. Antonio felt a sudden, sharp chill crawl up the back of his neck. Despite the fact that the temperature was nearly 90 degrees, he looked toward the line of trees where the shadows were the deepest, searching for whatever had caught his children's attention. He saw a flicker of movement, something dark and fluid that did not match the erratic swaying of the branches. It was a silhouette that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, standing perfectly motionless against the pine bark. He opened his mouth to call out to his wife, but the words felt stuck in his throat like dry sand. The pressure in the forest seemed to rise in a single, silent wave, a physical weight that made the simple act of standing up feel impossible. Antonio watched as the figure in the trees stepped forward into a sliver of sunlight, but he could not make out a face or any identifying features. It was a presence that felt professional, cold, and entirely out of place in a public park. The situational pressure tightened until it felt like a physical band around his chest. Antonio looked at Maria, wanting to tell her to grab the children and run toward the car. But her eyes were already fixed on the figure. She didn't look afraid in a typical way. She looked resigned, as if she were witnessing a force of nature that could not be bargained with. He realized in that moment that the safety of the city walls meant nothing in the face of a hunter who knew how to move in the silence. Shift POV to Mateo, a 60-year-old shepherd who had spent his entire life walking the hills surrounding Melilla. He was a man of very few words, mostly because he spent more time talking to his goats than he did to people. He knew every rock, every ravine, and every shortcut in the Rostrogordo forest. To Mateo, the woods were not a place for recreation, but a living map that he read with his feet every single day. Mateo was leading his small flock toward a watering hole on the far side of the pine grove when he noticed Antonio's sedan parked in the clearing. He recognized the car because it was one of the few in the neighborhood that was always kept perfectly clean. He looked toward the Chicano family's picnic spot, expecting to see them packing up for the day. But the scene he saw through the trees made him stop in his tracks, his hand tightening on his wooden staff. The family was sitting in a perfect circle on their checkered blanket, their bodies arranged with a strange, clinical precision. Antonio was leaning against the tree. Maria was sitting upright, and the two children were tucked close to their mother's sides. From a distance, they looked like they were simply enjoying the silence of the afternoon. But Mateo noticed that a swarm of flies was already beginning to circle the half-eaten fruit that sat in the center of the blanket. As he walked closer, the bells on his goats' collars were the only sound in the entire forest. He reached the edge of the blanket and looked down, his breath hitching in his chest. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned baskets, and no evidence of a robbery. Each member of the family had been shot at extremely close range with a precision that suggested the work of an expert. The forest had not echoed with the sound of gunfire because the execution had been as silent as the grave. Mateo did not scream. He simply turned and began to run back toward the city gates as fast as his old legs would carry him. He was so deeply traumatized by the sight of the peaceful, a silent circle, that he would later lose the ability to speak for several weeks. He reached the military checkpoint and pointed frantically back toward the woods, his eyes wide with a terror that the soldiers had never seen before. The alarm was raised, and the city was plunged into a state of chaos. General Gomez, the military governor of Melilla, arrived at the scene within 30 minutes, accompanied by a full detail of armed soldiers. He was a man who had seen combat in the colonial wars, but even he was shaken by the coldness of the Rostrogordo Massacre. He ordered a total lockdown of the territory, closing the borders with Morocco and the port to all traffic. He believed the killer must still be hiding within the 5 square miles of the exclave. The investigation that followed was the most intensive in the history of the Spanish territories in North Africa. Every soldier stationed in the city was questioned. Every transit point was inspected, and every local resident with a criminal record was brought in for interrogation. But the police found absolutely nothing. There was no weapon recovered, no shell casings left behind, and not a single witness who had heard a gunshot or seen a suspicious vehicle. The forensics team was baffled by the lack of physical evidence at the scene. The wounds were clean and indicated the use of a small caliber weapon, likely equipped with a high-end silencer that was not available to the general public. This led to a theory that the family had been targeted by a professional hitman or a government agent. But there was a glaring problem with that theory. Antonio Chicano was a simple shopkeeper with no political ties and no enemies. The mystery deepened when the investigators checked the family's background for any hidden debts or secrets. They found a life that was as transparent as glass. Antonio had never been involved in the local smuggling trades that were common in Melilla, and Maria had no connections to any radical groups. They were a family that lived for their Sunday picnics and their quiet evenings at home. There was no reason on earth for them to be executed in the middle of a public park. As the weeks turned into months, the pressure from the public began to mount. The people of Melilla were living in a state of constant fear, believing that a ghost was moving through their streets. The idea that an entire family could be wiped out in broad daylight without a single sound was unthinkable in such a small, militarized space. Theories began to circulate about a military training exercise gone wrong, or a case of mistaken identity by international agents. A meaning-shifting clue arrived nearly a year later when a similar set of silent, precise murders was reported in a different Spanish territory. The method was identical, a clean, quiet execution with no apparent motive and no physical evidence. It suggested the work of a phantom operative who moved across borders with ease. Someone who viewed murder not as a crime, but as a technical task to be completed and forgotten, but the connection was never officially proven. The climax of the mystery remains the absolute silence of the Rostrogordo forest on that Sunday afternoon. There were at least 5 other families within 200 yards of the Chicano picnic spot, yet not one person reported hearing a struggle or a scream. The killer had moved with such speed and silence that he had effectively removed 4 people from the world without disturbing the peace of a single bird in the trees. It was a masterclass in professional violence. The scene reconstruction suggested that the killer had approached from the thickest part of the brush, likely using the shade to stay invisible until he was within a few feet of the blanket. He must have worked with a level of coldness that is rare even among career criminals, moving from person to person in a matter of seconds. He left the fruit on the blanket and the car keys in the ignition, showing that his only interest was the lives of the people sitting in that circle. While there is no confirmed profile of the killer, investigators in the decades since have focused on the idea of a stay-behind agent or a specialized military unit. The level of skill required to perform such a hit in a high-security zone points towards someone with advanced, state-sponsored training. He was a person who could disappear into a crowd of soldiers as easily as he could vanish into a pine forest. He was a shadow that the law was never meant to catch. The Rostrogordo Massacre remains the most famous cold case in the history of Melilla, a heavy weight that the city still carries 50 years later. The pine forest is still a popular spot for picnics, but the local legends warn against staying after the sun begins to dip below the trees. In 2026, the case is a frequent topic for historical true crime investigators who still search for a motive that simply might not exist. The forest holds its secret with a stubborn, quiet pride. That was 1974. But while the silence in Melilla was born of a hidden shooter, the silence on a Roman beach just a year later would be broken by the roar of an engine and the shouts of a hit squad. In the next case, a man of words would find that some stories are finished not with a pen, but with the weight of a speeding car. People talk about how dangerous the world is, but most of the time, the danger doesn't come from a stranger in a dark alley. It comes from the places where you feel most at home, in the moments when you are least prepared to fight back. In the end, the only thing more terrifying than a mystery with too many clues is a tragedy that leaves behind nothing but the sound of the wind. On the night of November 1st, 1975, a metallic silver Alfa Romeo GT 1600 sat idling on the dark, trash-strewn edges of the Idroscalo in Ostia. The engine emitted a low, rhythmic thrum that was nearly swallowed by the sound of the cold Tyrrhenian Sea hitting the nearby shoreline. Inside the cabin, the dashboard lights cast a faint, clinical glow over the expensive leather seats and the 2 figures sitting in the front. Outside the glass, the world was a desolate wasteland of half-built shacks and muddy tracks, lit only by a thin sliver of a moon. Pier Paolo Pasolini sat behind the steering wheel, his hands resting lightly on the gear shift as he looked out into the darkness. He was 53 years old, and perhaps the most controversial man in all of Italy. A filmmaker and poet whose work often acted like a mirror for the country's deepest secrets. He was a man who lived in the high-stakes world of cinema and literature, but he often found himself drawn to the gritty, unpolished reality of the Roman outskirts. To him, these forgotten places held a truth that the bright lights of the city could never replicate. Earlier that evening, he had pulled his car up to the bustling Termini station in the heart of Rome, a place where the air always smelled of diesel and cheap espresso. He moved through the crowd with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for among the neon signs and the shifting shadows. He eventually stopped near a 17-year-old boy named Pino Pelosi, a young man the local police knew as the Frog because of his prominent eyes. They spoke for a few moments, the director's voice calm and inviting against the chaotic noise of the station. The two men decided to head toward a small restaurant called Al Biondo Tevere, located along the dark banks of the Tiber River. The owner recognized the famous director immediately and showed them to a quiet table in the back, away from the prying eyes of the other patrons. Pasolini ordered a simple meal of pasta and wine, watching the boy across from him with a look of quiet, intellectual curiosity. He often used these encounters as research for his stories, seeking out the raw, unedited language of the Roman street youth. By the time they finished their meal, the city had settled into a heavy, late-night lull that made every distant siren sound like a warning. Pasolini paid the bill in cash and led the boy back to the silver Alfa Romeo, the heavy car door shutting with a solid, expensive thud. He drove through the winding streets of Rome, eventually leaving the historic architecture behind as they headed toward the coast. The road toward Ostia was long and poorly lit, a strip of asphalt that seemed to lead away from civilization and into a different kind of silence. He liked the feeling of the car beneath him, the way the high-performance engine responded to the slightest pressure of his foot. He was a man who appreciated precision and power, whether it was in a camera lens or a mechanical cylinder. As they crossed the city limits, the atmosphere inside the car became quieter, the conversation dropping off as the city lights faded in the rearview mirror. The boy sat low in the passenger seat, his eyes darting toward the dark fields that lined the highway on either side. They reached the Idroscalo, a desolate area near the seaplain basin that felt more like a construction site than a seaside destination. Pasolini steered the car off the main road and onto a bumpy dirt track, the headlights bouncing over deep ruts and discarded pieces of wood. He finally stopped the car in a wide, muddy clearing just a few hundred yards from the water. The only signs of life were the distant, flickering lights of the airport and the occasional rustle of the wind through the tall, dry grass. The first off-note detail arrived when Pasolini turned off the headlights, plunging the interior of the car into a total, suffocating blackness. For a few seconds, the only thing that could be heard was the ticking of the cooling engine and the sound of the wind pushing against the glass. He reached into his pocket for a cigarette, the flare of his lighter illuminating the sharp angles of his face for a single, brief moment. He noticed that the boy was no longer looking at him, but was instead staring intently at the dark perimeter of the clearing. He felt a subtle shift in the air, a drop in pressure that made the hair on his arms stand up, even though the car was warm. He rolled down his window just a few inches, hoping to catch the scent of the sea. But instead he smelled something metallic and sharp. He thought he heard the sound of footsteps on the gravel, a rhythmic crunching that did not match the erratic movement of the wind. He gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, realizing that the silence of the beach was not as empty as it had seemed. Shift POV to Pino Pelosi, who sat in the passenger seat with his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was a slight boy, weighing barely 120 pounds. And he felt dwarfed by the presence of the older man and the heavy, expensive car. He had come here expecting a simple transaction, but the darkness of the Idroscalo felt like it was closing in on him from all sides. He kept his hands in his lap, his fingers twitching as he waited for a signal that he knew was coming from somewhere outside. He looked at the silhouette of the director and felt a wave of cold, calculated fear that had nothing to do with the man sitting next to him. He knew that there were other cars parked further back in the shadows, vehicles that had followed them from the city without their lights on. He had been told exactly what to do and what would happen if he failed to play his part in the night's events. The situational pressure was becoming a physical weight, making it hard for him to sit still or keep his breathing steady. The boy suddenly reached for the door handle, the mechanical click sounding like a gunshot in the quiet cabin of the Alfa Romeo. He stepped out into the mud, his boots sinking into the soft earth as he moved away from the car toward the tall grass. He didn't look back at the director, who was now stepping out of the driver's side to see where he was going. The boy felt the cold air hit his face, and for a second, he thought about running toward the water and never looking back at the silver car or the men in the shadows. Shift POV to a resident of the shantytown who lived in a small wooden shack just a few dozen yards from the clearing. He was a man who was used to the strange sounds of the Ostia night. From the roar of the plains to the shouting of drunks near the water, he was sitting at a small table, trying to fix a broken lantern by the light of a single candle. The beat of his hammer was the only thing he could hear until a loud, aggressive shout broke through the walls of his home. He stopped his work and leaned toward the window, his eyes straining to see into the darkness of the clearing. He saw the headlights of the silver car suddenly flare to life, the beams cutting through the dust and highlighting several figures moving near the rear of the vehicle. There was a sound of a struggle, a heavy thud of something hitting the ground, and then a series of voices, shouting words he couldn't quite make out. The pressure of the moment felt like a storm breaking, a sudden explosion of violence in a place that was usually just lonely. He thought about the fragility of a human life, how easily it could be snuffed out in a place where nobody was supposed to be looking. He watched as the silver car suddenly roared to life, the tires spinning in the mud before finding traction and racing across the clearing. It moved with a terrifying, purposeful speed, jumping over the ruts in the earth before disappearing toward the main road. The resident stayed in his shack, his hand trembling as he blew out his candle and waited for the morning sun to reveal what the night had left behind. The discovery happened at dawn, when a local woman was walking her dog near the edges of the seaplain basin. She saw a dark shape lying in the dirt near a pile of discarded wood, something that did not belong in the natural landscape of the beach. As she got closer, she realized it was a man, his clothes torn and his body showing signs of extreme, heavy trauma. He was lying face down in the mud, and it was clear to her that he had been run over by a vehicle with significant force. The police arrived shortly after, cordoning off the area and beginning the grim task of identifying the victim. They found a set of tire tracks that matched the tread of an Alfa Romeo, and the forensic evidence suggested that the man had been beaten severely before the car was used against him. When they searched the pockets of his jacket, they found the identification that confirmed the victim was Pier Paolo Pasolini. The news of the director's death sent a shockwave through Rome, turning a cold morning into a national tragedy. Pino Pelosi was arrested just a few hours later, caught driving Pasolini's silver car in a reckless manner through the streets of the city. He initially confessed to the crime, claiming that he had acted alone in a crime of passion after a disagreement with the director. He told the investigators that he had beaten the man with a wooden board and then run him over as he tried to escape the scene. The case seemed closed, a simple and tragic end to a complicated life. But the details did not quite fit the boy's story. Shift POV to a detective named Mario, who was tasked with reviewing the forensic files in the weeks following the murder. He was a man who believed in the logic of physics, and the physics of the Ostia beach did not match the confession of a 17-year-old boy. Pasolini had been a physically fit man, a regular soccer player who was known for his strength and his ability to defend himself. Mario found it impossible to believe that a slight, unarmored teenager could have inflicted such a massive level of damage without help. He looked at the photos of the crime scene and noticed that the blood spatters were spread over a wide area, suggesting a struggle that involved multiple attackers. There were also reports from residents who claimed to have heard several cars and the voices of men with southern Italian accents shouting political slurs. The detective began to suspect that the boy was merely a pawn in a much larger and more dangerous game. He felt the weight of a secret that the higher-ups in the department did not seem interested in uncovering. The investigation stalled as the official narrative of a lone killer was pushed by the authorities. But the questions refused to go away. Friends of the director, like Sergio Citti, began to speak out about a potential trap that had been set for Pasolini. Citti claimed that several reels of the director's latest film, Salo, had been stolen, and that Pasolini had gone to the beach that night because he believed he was meeting the thieves to buy them back. This suggested a level of premeditation that went far beyond a random encounter at a train station. The twist in the case did not arrive for another 30 years. Long after the initial trial had ended and the public had moved on. In 2005, Pino Pelosi appeared on a national television program and officially recanted his confession. He claimed that he had been threatened into silence by 3 men with Southern accents who had actually carried out the killing. He said they had called Pasolini a dirty communist and a filthy degenerate while they beat him, warning the boy that his family would be killed if he ever told the truth. This revelation shifted the meaning of everything that had happened on that dark beach in 1975. It turned a private tragedy into a potential political assassination. Executed by professional enforcers or neo-fascist thugs, the boy had spent decades in and out of prison, carrying the weight of a crime he claimed he did not commit, while the real killers remained in the shadows. The theory of a state-sponsored hit began to gain traction, suggesting that Pasolini was silenced because of what he was about to reveal in his final, unfinished book. The climax of the story is the reconstruction of those final minutes at the Idroscalo, seen through the lens of a coordinated attack. Pasolini was likely lured out of his car and surrounded by at least 3 men who had been waiting in the tall grass. They used heavy chains and wooden slats to break his spirit and his body, moving with a cold, professional efficiency that left him no chance to escape. He was a man who lived by the power of his voice, but in his final moments, his only audience was the sound of the ocean. The final blow was delivered not with a weapon, but with the silver Alfa Romeo itself. The killers forced the boy into the passenger seat or made him watch as they drove the heavy car over the director's body, ensuring that the evidence would point toward a vehicular accident or a lone driver. They left the car for the boy to take, knowing that his criminal record and his presence at the scene would make him the perfect scapegoat. They vanished into the night, leaving behind a battered genius and a silver car idling in the mud. The killer profile for this case remains unofficially linked to a group of politically motivated enforcers who viewed Pasolini as a threat to the established order. They were men who understood the utility of a desolate place and the power of a credible threat. They did not just want to kill a man, they wanted to bury a message. They used the boy as a human shield for their actions, successfully hiding behind his confession for more than 3 decades, while the evidence slowly turned to dust. In 2026, the case of Pier Paolo Pasolini remains Italy's most debated intellectual assassination. The Idroscalo beach now holds a monument to the director, a stark concrete pillar that stands as a reminder of what happened in the mud. The case was formally reopened for DNA testing in the 2010s, and investigators found several unknown genetic profiles on Pasolini's clothing. These profiles have never been matched to any known suspects, leaving the names of the men with Southern accents as a void in the historical record. The silver car and the dark beach have become part of the cinematic legend of Italy, a story that ends not with a resolution, but with a question. Pasolini once wrote that the truth is not always beautiful, but it is necessary. His death remains a testament to that belief, a heavy aftertaste that lingers long after the engine has cooled and the waves have washed away the tracks in the sand. There is a specific kind of cold that comes from a death that feels less like a crime and more like a message. It is the feeling of a world where the powerful can move through the shadows without ever being seen. In our next case, that message was delivered on a dark highway shoulder in South Korea, where a socialite found that having the names of the powerful in your book is not the same thing as having them on your side. On the night of March 17th, 1970, a black Corona sedan sat perfectly still on the shoulder of the Gangbayon Expressway in Seoul. The engine was idling, sending a faint, rhythmic vibration through the frame of the car and into the asphalt of the dark highway. Inside the cabin, the dome light remained off, leaving the interior in a heavy, pressurized shadow that was only broken by the flickering yellow light of the distant street lamps reflecting off the Han River. Jong In-suk was 25 years old and was arguably the most well-connected woman in all of South Korea. She worked as a high-society hostess at a premier kissing house called Sancheong-gak, a place where the political and business elite gathered to settle the future of the nation over expensive traditional meals. She was not merely a face in the room. She was a keeper of confidences who navigated the most dangerous circles of power with a quiet, observant grace that made her indispensable to the men who ran the country. She lived a life that most people in Seoul could only observe from the pages of a magazine or a distance of 100 yards. Her wardrobe was a collection of fine silks and rare jewelry, and she moved through the capital with a level of independence that was almost unheard of for women in that era. Her presence at a dinner table was a signal of the highest status, often reserved for government ministers, powerful generals, and perhaps even the president himself. Behind the glamour of her public persona, she maintained a private record of her world that she guarded with extreme care. She carried a small, leather-bound address book that contained over 20 names, representing the absolute pinnacle of the Korean hierarchy. This book was not a directory of friends, but a map of her influence and a potential weapon for anyone who wanted to disrupt the established order. She understood that her social standing was built on a foundation of secrets that many would kill to keep. Her young son was 3 years old, a boy whose paternity was the subject of intense and fearful whispers throughout the halls of the Blue House. She treated the child with a fierce, unwavering protectiveness, knowing that his existence was a physical tie to a man whose identity could topple a government. She moved through her days with the weight of this knowledge, always aware that her value to the elite was constantly being weighed against the threat she represented to their reputations. The Kisang house was a world of hushed conversations and expensive perfume, where the air was thick with the smoke of imported cigars. In this space, she was a professional who knew when to speak and when to remain silent, a skill that allowed her to hear things that were never meant for public record. She watched the men around her as they drank and bragged, noting the connections and the rivalries that defined the political landscape of the 1970s. She often returned home in the early morning hours, the city of Seoul appearing like a quiet, gray ghost outside the windows of her luxury sedan. The streets were usually empty, save for the occasional police patrol or a street sweeper moving slowly through the intersections. She liked the stillness of the pre-dawn hours because it was the only time when the pressure of her life felt like it might finally lift. It was a brief window of peace before the next day of high-stakes navigation began. Her brother, Jung Jong-wook, served as her primary driver and her most trusted confidant. He was a man who lived entirely in the shadow of his sister's influence, handling the practical details of her household while staying out of the public eye. He sat behind the wheel of the Corona on that cold March night, his eyes fixed on the road as they traveled along the expressway. He was a man of few words, someone who had learned that his sister's secrets were his own burden to carry. The first off-note detail arrived when the car began to slow down without any sign of a mechanical failure or a flat tire. The Corona pulled onto the dark shoulder of the highway, its tires crunching softly on the gravel before coming to a complete stop. The silence of the car's interior was suddenly broken by the sharp, metallic click of a safety being disengaged. The smell of expensive perfume was replaced by the cold, biting scent of oil and steel as the pressure inside the cabin began to rise. Jong-wook looked at his sister in the passenger seat, his hands tightening on the steering wheel until his knuckles were bone white. The transition from a routine drive to a moment of total crisis happened without a single word of warning or explanation. The situational pressure became a physical force, a no-win dilemma that had been set in motion long before they ever reached the highway. He realized that the car had become a closed box where only one version of the truth would be allowed to survive. The discovery was made by a passing motorist who noticed the luxury sedan idling in the darkness of the expressway. He pulled his own car over, thinking that someone might have run out of gas. and walked toward the passenger side of the Corona. The glass of the window was shattered, the fragments glittering like thousands of tiny diamonds on the shoulder of the road. Inside, the socialite was slumped against the door, her silk dress stained with a deep, spreading red that looked black in the moonlight. The police response was immediate and unusually heavy for a roadside shooting in Seoul. Within an hour, high-ranking officers and intelligence agents had cordoned off the entire stretch of the Gangbayan Expressway, pushing back the press and any curious witnesses. They found Jong-wook wounded but alive, his voice flat as he repeated a story that seemed to have been rehearsed in advance. He claimed that he had accidentally shot his sister during a heated argument about her lifestyle. The investigation was conducted with a swiftness that bordered on the suspicious, with the authorities declaring the case solved within just a few days. They pointed to the brother's confession as the final and only word on the matter, claiming the motive was a simple domestic dispute over money. However, the forensic details began to leak out through unofficial channels, and they did not match the official narrative of a clumsy, accidental shooting by a distraught family member. The caliber of the bullets found at the scene was a professional grade, and the pattern of the shots suggested a level of marksmanship that the brother did not possess. There were no signs of a struggle inside the car, no defensive wounds on the victim, and no evidence of an argument. It looked less like a spontaneous fight and more like a clinical, surgical execution carried out by someone who knew exactly where to aim in the dark to ensure a lethal result. The meaning-shifting clue arrived when the content of the leather-bound address book was leaked to the public. The list of names was a roster of the most powerful men in the country, including the Prime Minister and several high-ranking cabinet members. The realization that the victim held the personal secrets of the ruling elite changed the case from a domestic tragedy into a high-level political scandal. It was a revelation that threatened to consume the government from the inside out. Public theory held that the sister had been silenced because she was about to reveal a secret that would have ruined multiple political careers, or perhaps the presidency itself. The brother was seen not as a killer, but as a man who was forced to take the fall to save his own life or protect the rest of his family. He was sentenced to 19 years in prison, a punishment that felt more like a trade for a secret that was never allowed to be told in court. The climax of the mystery occurred decades later. When Jong-wook was finally released from his long prison term, he immediately recanted his confession, claiming that he had been tortured and threatened by state intelligence agents until he agreed to sign the official story. He spoke of a professional hitman who had appeared from the shadows of the highway, fired the fatal shots, and then vanished into the night, leaving the brother to face the consequences of the state's actions. The truth revealed a reconstruction of the event where the car was likely intercepted by a second vehicle on the expressway. It was a surgical strike designed to look like a family tragedy, allowing the government to bury the socialite and her secrets while maintaining a layer of plausible deniability. The method was cold and precise, removing a person of influence who had become a significant liability to the men who once sought her company and her silence. The killer detail that remains is the identity of the professional who pulled the trigger that night. Many believe it was an operative from the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, a ghost who functioned as the ultimate enforcer for the ruling regime. He was a man who moved through the dark with the backing of the state, ensuring that the information inside that address book would never be used as a weapon against the powerful men who governed the nation. In 2026, the murder of Jong In-suk remains a frequent subject for South Korean historical mystery dramas and investigative journalists. The case is a symbol of the dark side of a rapid modernization era, where the glamour of high society was often just a thin veneer over a world of bullets and buried truths. The true identity of her son's father is still a guarded secret, a final piece of a puzzle that the state refuses to finish. A leather-bound address book filled with names and a shattered window on a cold highway. These items were the only witnesses to a secret that died in the dark of a 1970 night. In London, the item left behind was a lead pipe in a basement, another piece of evidence in a case where a man of status decided that vanishing was the only way to escape the truth he had created with his own hands. A Around 9 o'clock on the evening of November 7th, 1974, a man stood in the shadows of a kitchen in a high-end townhouse in Belgravia. The air was cool and smelled faintly of expensive cigar smoke and old floor wax. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, gold lighter, the mechanical click of the lid echoing against the tiled walls. He did not strike the flame, instead just feeling the weight of the metal in his hand as he waited for the house to go quiet. Richard John Bingham, better known as the 7th Earl of Lucan, was a man whose life was defined by the appearance of control. To the members of the exclusive Claremont Club, he was lucky, a dashing aristocrat with a steady hand at the gambling tables and a perfectly tailored suit. He moved through the world of the London elite with a practiced ease, his tall frame and military posture suggesting a life without a single worry. He was the kind of man people looked at when they wanted to see what old British power looked like in the 20th century. Behind the closed doors of his club, however, the luck of the Earl had completely run dry. He was buried under gambling debts that totaled over £200,000, a staggering amount that he had no realistic way of paying back. His marriage to Lady Veronica Lucan had collapsed into a bitter and public legal war over the custody of their 3 young children. Every day was a fight for control over a life that was rapidly crumbling into a pile of bills and legal notices. Richard spent his afternoons at the Claremont, nursing a single drink and watching the high rollers move massive amounts of cash across the green felt. He maintained his stoic expression, but his mind was constantly calculating his mounting losses and the cost of his private investigators. He believed that his wife was unfit to raise their children, and he had become obsessed with proving it to a judge. This obsession had pushed him to the edge of his financial and mental limits, leaving him desperate for a way out. The townhouse at 46 Lower Belgrave Street was a grand 5-story building that should have been a place of comfort and family. Instead, it had become a battlefield where every conversation was recorded and every action was scrutinized for legal leverage. Richard had moved out of the family home into a small apartment nearby, but his thoughts never left the halls of the big house. He spent hours watching the front door from his car, tracking the movements of his wife and the people who worked for her. Sandra Rivet was 29 years old and had recently started working as the nanny for the Lucan children. She was a kind, hard-working woman who had moved to London seeking a fresh start after her own marriage had ended. She enjoyed the routine of the household, finding peace in the simple tasks of preparing meals and getting the children ready for bed. To her, the Earl was a distant, formal figure who occasionally appeared to take the children out for the afternoon, always dressed in a perfect suit. On this particular Thursday evening, the house was operating on its usual schedule. Sandra had finished bathing the 3 children and was settling them into their rooms on the upper floors. The grand staircase was quiet, and the only sound was the soft ticking of the clock in the main hallway. She felt a sense of quiet accomplishment as she closed the final bedroom door, knowing that her work for the day was nearly finished. She planned to have a cup of tea before heading to her own quarters. Sandra walked down the stairs toward the kitchen, her footsteps muffled by the thick, expensive carpeting. She reached the ground floor and headed toward the basement stairs, where the tea kettle was kept. The basement was a labyrinth of storage rooms and utility spaces that always felt a few degrees colder than the rest of the house. She reached for the light switch at the top of the stairs, but the bulb did not flicker to life. The stairwell remained a dark, uninviting void that seemed to pull at the light from the hallway. Richard stood at the bottom of those stairs, his breathing shallow and his heart racing in a way that he had not felt since his days in the military. He held a length of lead pipe that he had wrapped in heavy tape to make it easier to grip in the dark. He had entered the house using a spare key and had carefully unscrewed the light bulb in the basement to ensure he would remain hidden. In his mind, he was not a criminal, but a man taking a necessary, surgical action to save his family. He had spent weeks planning this moment, convinced that the only way to regain control of his life was to remove the primary obstacle. He believed that with his wife gone, the custody battle would end, and he could find a way to settle his debts with the help of his wealthy friends. He stood in the absolute blackness of the basement, listening to the soft creak of the floorboards above his head. He knew the routine of the house perfectly, and he was waiting for the one person who stood in the way of his plan. Sandra stepped onto the first wooden stair, her hand reaching out for the railing to guide her through the darkness. She assumed the bulb had simply burned out and did not think twice about descending into the basement. She moved slowly, her eyes trying to adjust to the faint glow coming from the hallway behind her. As she reached the bottom step, she felt a sudden, heavy shift in the air, a movement that was too large to be a draft from the window. The transition from the ordinary quiet of the evening to a state of total crisis happened in a single, silent second. Richard moved with a desperate, clumsy force, swinging the lead pipe in the dark toward the figure he assumed was his wife. He did not speak, and he did not hesitate, driven by a crumbling psyche and a misguided sense of entitlement. He believed that this one act of violence would solve every problem he had, unaware that he was currently making the most catastrophic mistake of his life. The situational pressure in the dark basement became an explosion of chaotic movement. Sandra had no time to scream or defend herself as the heavy metal struck her in the darkness. She collapsed onto the stone floor, her tea tray clattering against the wall with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire 5-story house. Richard stood over her, his chest heaving as he realized that the person he had just attacked was significantly shorter and lighter than the woman he had intended to find. Veronica Lukin was sitting in her bedroom on the second floor, waiting for Sandra to bring her a cup of tea. She was a woman who had become accustomed to the tension of the house, but the sudden, sharp clatter from the basement made her sit upright. She called out for Sandra, but there was no response from the lower floors. The silence that followed was heavy and unnatural, a void that made her feel a sudden, sharp prickle of alarm on the back of her neck. She stood up and walked to the landing. Looking down the dark stairwell toward the ground floor, she called out again, her voice sounding thin and small in the grand space of the townhouse. She began to walk down the stairs, her hand tightening on the banister as she moved toward the source of the noise. She reached the kitchen and saw the door to the basement standing wide open, a dark rectangle that seemed to lead nowhere. She walked to the top of the stairs and peered into the shadows. A man emerged from the darkness of the basement, his face partially obscured by the shadows, but his silhouette unmistakably familiar. Veronica recognized the height, the posture, and the specific way he held himself, even in the middle of a nightmare. It was her husband, Richard, and he was holding a heavy object in his hand that looked like a piece of plumbing. He did not look like the Lucky she had seen at the clubs. He looked like a man who had completely lost his connection to the world. He lunged toward her, and the two of them began a desperate, silent struggle in the narrow hallway of the kitchen. Richard tried to pull her down into the darkness of the basement, his hands gripping her throat while she fought to stay on her feet. She realized in that moment that she was fighting for her life against the man she had once loved. The pressure of the struggle was absolute, a no-win dilemma where her only chance was to find a way to break his concentration and escape into the street. Veronica managed to calm him down for a single, brief moment by telling him that she would help him escape if he just let her go. It was a desperate lie told in the middle of a struggle, and it worked just long enough for him to loosen his grip. She turned and ran through the front door, bursting onto the quiet street of Lower Belgrave Street. She ran toward the nearest light she could see, which was a local pub called the Plumber's Arms, located just a few dozen yards away. She burst through the heavy wooden doors of the pub, her face covered in blood and her clothes torn. The patrons looked up from their drinks in total shock as she screamed that her husband had murdered the nanny and tried to kill her. The bartender immediately called the police, while several men stepped outside to see if anyone was following her. The ordinary evening at the pub was instantly transformed into a crime scene, the air thick with the smell of spilled beer and the sound of frantic voices. The police arrived at the Lucan townhouse within minutes, their blue lights flashing against the white stone facades of the wealthy neighborhood. They found the front door standing open and the house eerily quiet. As they moved through the ground floor and into the basement, they found the light bulb unscrewed and the tea tray lying on the floor. In a large canvas sack tucked into a corner, They discovered the body of Sandra Rivet. The Earl of Lucan was nowhere to be found. A massive search was launched for the missing aristocrat, covering the entire city of London and the surrounding counties. Investigators found that Richard had visited a friend's house shortly after the attack, claiming that he had interrupted an intruder who was killing the nanny. He had appeared disheveled and agitated, asking for a drink and a way to get to the coast. He told his friend that his wife would blame him for everything and that he needed to get away to clear his name. He borrowed a small Ford Corsair from a friend and drove south toward the coast of East Sussex. He stopped at several points to write letters to his relatives and his gambling friends, insisting on his innocence and asking them to look after his children. These letters were written in a calm, almost formal hand, the work of a man who was still trying to maintain the appearance of an earl, even as he fled from a murder scene. He seemed to believe that his status would eventually protect him from the truth. 3 days after the murder, the Ford Corsair was found abandoned in the town of New Haven, parked near the harbor where the ferries left for France. The car was empty, but the interior was stained with blood that matched the nanny's type. In the trunk, police found a length of lead pipe that was identical to the one recovered from the basement in London. It was a meaning-shifting clue that shattered his story of an intruder. The weapon had been prepared and carried in his own car. The discovery of the car at the harbor led to a nationwide obsession with the fate of Lord Lucan. Had he jumped onto a ferry and escaped to the continent? Or had he walked into the dark, freezing waters of the English Channel? His wealthy friends at the Claremont Club were suspected of hiding him or helping him fly out of the country on a private plane. For the next 50 years, the name Lucan became synonymous with a high society cover-up and a vanishing act that had no resolution. The climax of the mystery is the moment Richard stood on the docks in New Haven, looking out at the black water of the harbor. He was a man who had lost his money, his family, and his title in a single, botched evening of violence. He had intended to be the master of his own fate, but he had ended up as a fugitive with a lead pipe and a car full of evidence. He stepped away from the car and walked into the shadows of the port, never to be seen by the public again. The truth revealed during the scene reconstruction was that Richard had completely misjudged the timing of the household. He had expected his wife to go to the basement for the tea, unaware that Sandra had offered to do it instead. His plan was built on a foundation of entitlement and the belief that he could simply delete a person to solve a financial problem. The method was clumsy and brutal, the work of a desperate amateur who thought his status made him a professional. The killer detail that remains is the lead pipe found in the trunk of the Corsair. It was not just a weapon, it was proof of premeditation. He had carried it with him, wrapped it in tape, and brought it into a dark basement to use on his own family. This one object turned a potential crime of passion into a calculated murder attempt. It stripped away the lucky persona and revealed a man who was willing to destroy everything to maintain his own comfort. In 2026, the disappearance of Lord Lucan remains the United Kingdom's most famous cold case. He was officially declared dead for probate purposes in 2016, but the sightings have never stopped. Every few years, a report emerges of an elderly British man living in a remote part of Africa or South America who looks just like the missing Earl. For 50 years, the case has stood as a symbol of the Claremont set and the secrets that the British aristocracy is capable of keeping. The townhouse in Belgravia has long since been sold and renovated, but the basement still carries the weight of that November night. Richard John Bingham was a man who tried to gamble with lives and lost everything on a single, dark stairwell. He remains a phantom of the 1970s, a man who walked into the English Channel or the African bush and left behind only a lead pipe and a broken family. Justice is supposed to be blind, but sometimes it feels like it is just looking the other way, especially when the names in the address book are written in gold. That was 1974, while London searched its docks for a missing lord, half a world away in Brazil. Another basement was hiding a crime that an entire government was trying to forget. In the next case, a 7-year-old girl would learn that being chosen by a family friend can be the most dangerous thing in the world. On the afternoon of September 11th, 1973, the sun over Brasilia was a relentless, white glare reflecting off the concrete of a planned city. The capital of Brazil was designed to be a model of modern order, with its wide avenues and sterile government buildings standing like monuments to a future that was supposed to be perfectly calculated. There were no dark alleys or hidden corners in this city of the future, only open spaces where everything was meant to be seen and recorded. The heat at 2 o'clock was a physical weight that made the air inside the Lycée Français feel thick and stagnant. A 7-year-old girl named Anna Lydia stood near the front gates of the school, clutching a small set of plastic garden tools in her hand. She was waiting for her usual ride home, her small frame dwarfed by the massive, modern architecture of the campus. To anyone passing by, she was just another child of the capital's professional class, a girl whose life was built on a foundation of routine and predictable safety. Anna Lydia was the kind of child who moved through the world with a quiet, observant grace that made people describe her as bright for her age. She enjoyed the simple rituals of her day, from the starch in her school uniform to the way her mother packed her lunch with careful precision. Her family lived in a world of high-stakes government work. But for Anna Lydia, the most important thing was the small garden she was tending back at her apartment. The Braga family was well known in the social circles of Brasilia, a city where status was measured by your proximity to the military government that had ruled the country for nearly a decade. Her father worked as a civil servant, and her older brother, Álvaro Henrique, was a popular figure in the local youth scene. They lived in one of the luxury apartment blocks that were reserved for the administrative elite, a place where the elevators were polished every morning and the hallways always smelled of industrial floor cleaner. In 1973, Brasilia was a city under a microscope. The military dictatorship was at the height of its power, and the capital was its primary showcase of control. People did not disappear from the streets of the perfect city unless they were targeted by the state for political reasons. For an ordinary 7-year-old girl, the idea of danger was as remote as the rainforests that had been cleared to build the very ground she stood on. The school day had ended just minutes earlier, and the sound of parents calling out to their children filled the air near the gates. Anna Lydia watched the other kids climb into their family cars, her eyes searching the street for the familiar vehicle that usually came for her. She was not a child who wandered off or talked to strangers, having been raised with the specific, cautious manners required of families living in the heart of a military state. She stood near a concrete pillar, the plastic garden tools clicking softly against her leg as she waited. She was a small person in a city built for giants, a flash of white and blue against the gray landscape of the school. The heat made the asphalt of the street shimmer, creating a hazy, distorted view of the cars idling near the entrance. To the school staff, she looked exactly like a child who was waiting for someone she knew and trusted to arrive. A dark car pulled up to the curb just a few feet from where Anna Lydia was standing. A man stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward her with a casual, relaxed gait that suggested he was a regular visitor to the family home. He spoke to the school attendant for a brief moment, claiming he was a close friend of the Bragas and had been sent to pick up the girl because her parents were running late. He spoke with the confidence of someone who belonged in the inner circles of the capital's elite. The attendant did not ask for identification or call the parents to verify the story. In a city where everyone seemed to know everyone else, the man's expensive clothes and authoritative tone were enough to bypass the usual security protocols. Anna Lydia looked at the man, and while she did not appear excited, she followed him toward the car without any sign of hesitation or fear. She climbed into the back seat, and the vehicle pulled away from the curb, merging into the afternoon traffic of the wide avenues. For the next several hours, the city of Brasilia continued its routine as if nothing had changed. The government ministers met in their glass offices, and the construction crews worked on the latest monuments to the state's progress. But at the Braga apartment, the air was beginning to grow heavy with a specific, cold kind of pressure. Anna Lydia's parents had arrived home to find that their daughter was not there, and the school had no record of who had picked her up. Álvaro Henrique, the older brother, began to call every friend and family member he could think of, his voice becoming more strained with every dial of the rotary phone. He drove his own car through the streets of the city, checking the parks and the shopping centers where he thought his sister might be playing. The situational pressure in the apartment was rising, a thick, suffocating weight that made it hard to focus on anything other than the ticking of the clock on the wall. The first off-note detail arrived when a witness reported seeing a car matching the description of the kidnapper's vehicle parked near a luxury apartment building in the north wing. The witness described seeing a man walking a small girl into the basement of the building, carrying a set of plastic garden tools. This detail was enough to push the family to contact the police, breaking the silence that usually surrounded the private lives of the capital's elite families. The police response was initially slow, hampered by the fact that the kidnapping involved high society figures during a time of extreme political sensitivity. The detectives who were assigned to the case found themselves navigating a maze of social connections and bureaucratic hurdles. They spent the night conducting interviews that felt more like formal social calls than criminal investigations. The pressure from the government to keep the matter quiet was already beginning to be felt at the precinct level. Shift Pav to Jose, a veteran detective who had worked in Brasilia since its founding. He was a man who believed in the logic of physical evidence, even in a city where politics often dictated the truth. He spent the early morning hours of the next day walking the perimeter of the University of Brasilia campus, following a tip from a groundskeeper who had seen something unusual in the tall grass near a service road. The air was cool and damp, and the only sound was the distant hum of the morning commute. Jose noticed a patch of flattened grass that led toward a small, muddy indentation in the earth. He walked slowly, his eyes scanning the ground for anything that did not belong in the natural landscape of the campus. He found the small set of plastic garden tools first, lying in the mud as if they had been dropped in a hurry. A few feet away, he discovered the body of Anna Lydia. She had been dead for several hours, and it was clear to the detective that she had been kept in a confined space before being brought to this location. The scene was a shocking contrast to the sterile, orderly image of the capital. The girl's hair had been roughly and unevenly hacked off, a detail that struck Jose as a sign of ritualized cruelty rather than a random act of violence. There were marks on her wrists and ankles that suggested she had been held in place for a long time. The detective felt a wave of cold fury that he had not experienced in years, realizing that the perfect city was hiding a monster that didn't care about the laws of men. The discovery of the body turned the kidnapping into a national tragedy, but it also triggered a massive, silent operation within the government to control the narrative. Jose and his team began to trace the movements of the dark car, eventually finding a link to the basement of a luxury apartment block inhabited by the sons of high-ranking military officials. When he entered the basement, he was hit by the overpowering smell of industrial floor cleaner, the same scent he had noticed in the elite buildings of the capital. He found a small, windowless storage room that had been recently scrubbed from floor to ceiling. Despite the cleaning, he found a small strand of hair that matched the victim's type, tucked into a crack in the concrete floor. The investigation was moving with a speed that usually resulted in an arrest. But Jose suddenly found his path blocked by his own superiors. He was told to slow down, to consider the broader implications of his work, and to focus his attention elsewhere. The meaning-shifting clue arrived when the names of the prime suspects were finally placed on the detective's desk. They were the sons of the military elite, including the son of a former cabinet minister and a high-ranking diplomat. These were young men who were considered untouchable in the current political climate, individuals who moved through the city with a sense of total impunity. Jose realized that he wasn't just investigating a murder, he was challenging the very foundation of the state's power. The situational pressure on the detective became an absolute, crushing weight. He was called into a meeting with a high-level official who informed him that the case was being federalized for reasons of national security. This was a legal maneuver used by the military government to take control of sensitive investigations and move them away from the public eye. Jose was ordered to hand over all of his files, his notes, and the physical evidence he had collected from the basement and the campus. He watched as armed military police officers entered his office and began to box up the records of the case. They didn't speak to him, and they didn't offer any explanation for the seizure. It was a cold, clinical removal of the truth, a process that felt more like a burial than an administrative transfer. The detective realized that the killers were being protected by the very system that was supposed to bring them to justice. He was a man of the law, but the law had just been rewritten in front of him. The twist in the case was the sudden and aggressive attempt to frame the victim's own brother, Álvaro Enrique, for the crime. The state-controlled media began to run stories suggesting that the kidnapping was a family matter gone wrong, an attempt to deflect suspicion away from the sons of the elite. Álvaro was brought in for hours of grueling interrogation, while the real suspects were allowed to leave the country or were given airtight alibis by their powerful fathers. The investigation effectively stopped in its tracks. The files that had been seized by the military police simply vanished into the massive bureaucracy of the federal government, and the leads that José had followed were never pursued again. The detective himself was reassigned to a remote post far from the capital, a move that was clearly designed to keep him from talking to the press or the victim's family. The city of Brasília returned to its sterile, orderly routine, but the shadow of the girl remained. The truth revealed during a reconstruction of those final 20 hours suggested that Ana Lydia had been lured into the basement by someone she recognized as a family friend. She had been kept in that small, sterile room while the young men decided what to do with a situation that had likely started as a cruel game and turned into a nightmare. They operated with a level of coldness that suggested they believed their status made them immune to the consequences of their actions. The climax of the tragedy occurred when the killers realized that they could not simply release the girl without exposing themselves. They chose to finish what they had started, moving with a clinical, surgical detachment to ensure that their secret would be buried with her. They used their knowledge of the city's service roads to dump the body on the university campus, knowing that the military police would handle the cleanup of the legal aftermath. The killer profile for this case is a group of young, affluent men who were raised in a world of absolute power and zero accountability. They were the princes of the military regime, individuals who viewed the rest of the population as a resource to be used and discarded. They didn't need a complex motive or a sophisticated plan. They only needed the protection of their fathers and the silence of a state that could not afford a scandal of this magnitude. In 2026, the murder of Ana Lydia remains the most famous cold case in the history of the Brazilian capital. The case is legally closed, and the statute of limitations has long since expired. But the memory of the girl the law forgot has not faded. Every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, people gather in Brasília for a quiet vigil, lighting candles in the open spaces where she once stood. The garden tools she carried have become a symbol of a childhood interrupted by the arrogance of the powerful. The city of the future still stands with its wide avenues and its white concrete monuments, but the sterile air carries a heavy aftertaste. Ana Lydia was a small person who was swallowed by a large system, a child who learned too late that a family friend can be the most dangerous shadow of all. Her story remains a testament to the fact that even in the most orderly city on earth, the darkness is never truly gone. It is just hidden behind a locked basement door and a thick coat of floor cleaner. Sometimes the thing that undoes a person isn't the danger itself. It's the moment right before, when everything still looked fine and the hand reaching out for yours belonged to someone you thought you knew. That was 1973. While Brazil tried to bury the memory of a schoolgirl, across the world in Japan, a different kind of silence was settling over the rice paddies. A silence that would last for 14 years and claim 7 lives before anyone realized the bicycle on the road was empty. On the late afternoon of August 27, 1975, a 12-year-old girl named Kumiko was pedaling her red bicycle along a narrow dirt path in the Saga prefecture. The sun was hanging low over the Kitakyushu Mountains, casting long, orange shadows across the endless green squares of the rice paddies. She was wearing her white school blouse and a dark skirt, her satchel bouncing slightly against her back with every rotation of the pedals. The sound of the bicycle chain clicking was the only noise in the heavy, humid air, a steady rhythm that matched her breathing. She was less than a mile from her family's farmhouse, a distance she had traveled hundreds of times since she was old enough to ride without help. The path was straight and clear, cutting through the heart of the countryside, where everyone knew whose daughter was passing by at this exact time every day. Kumiko's family had lived in the same village for generations, and her life was governed by the predictable cycles of the planting and harvesting seasons. Her father was a man of the earth, his hands calloused from years of tending to the crops that fed their small community. Her mother ran the household with a quiet efficiency, always ensuring that a hot meal was waiting on the table the moment the sun dipped below the horizon. In 1975, the rural areas of Japan felt like a world that time had forgotten to update. Doors were left unlocked, and children were expected to navigate the roads and paths with total independence. There was a collective understanding that the community looked out for its own, and a missing child was an idea that simply did not exist in the local vocabulary. It was a place where silence was a sign of peace, not a warning of danger. Kumiko was a quiet girl who enjoyed the small details of her surroundings, often stopping to look at the dragonflies hovering over the irrigation ditches. She was a diligent student who never missed a day of school and always arrived home exactly when she was expected. Her parents relied on her consistency, seeing it as a sign of her growing maturity and her respect for the family's traditions. That afternoon, her mother was in the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner of steamed rice and pickled vegetables. She looked at the clock on the wall and noted that it was exactly 5 o'clock, the time Kumiko usually turned into the driveway. She began to set the table, moving with a rhythm that had been perfected over years of domestic life. The house was quiet, save for the sound of the water boiling on the stove. 10 minutes passed, and the sound of the red bicycle's tires on the gravel driveway did not materialize. Her mother paused at the window, looking out toward the main road where the shadows of the pine trees were beginning to stretch across the dirt. She did not feel a sudden alarm, but rather a small, nagging sense of curiosity about what could have delayed her daughter on such a clear and quiet afternoon. She walked to the front gate and looked down the long, straight path that Kumiko always took home from school. The rice paddies were empty of people now that the workday was winding down, and the only movement was the swaying of the stalks in the light breeze. She called out her daughter's name, her voice carrying easily in the still air, but there was no response from the distance. By 5:30, the sun had dropped further, turning the sky a deep, bruised purple. Kumiko's father returned from the fields, his boots covered in the dark mud of the paddies. He saw his wife standing by the gate and immediately sensed the change in the atmosphere of the home. He didn't wait for her to speak. He simply asked if the girl had returned yet, his voice steady but laced with a new, sharp focus. The two of them began to walk down the path toward the school, their eyes scanning the ditches and the tall grass for any sign of a red bicycle. They moved quickly, their footsteps heavy on the hard-packed earth as the light continued to fail. Every few yards, they would stop and call out, but the only answer was the steady, rhythmic chirping of the evening cicadas. The transition from a quiet evening to a state of total crisis happened when they reached a bend in the road where the path narrowed between two large irrigation channels. There, standing perfectly upright against a wooden post, was Kumiko's red bicycle. It looked as if she had simply stepped off for a moment to look at something in the grass and intended to return within seconds. There were no signs of a struggle, no scuff marks in the dirt, and no indication that anyone else had been in the area. The girl's school satchel was still tucked into the basket on the front of the bike, its leather straps neatly buckled. It was a scene that made no logical sense in the context of their lives. A 12-year-old girl does not simply evaporate from a straight path in broad daylight. The first off-note detail was the absolute silence of the area surrounding the bicycle. Usually, the birds and the insects would be active in the brush, but the space felt strangely hollow. as if the air itself had been scrubbed of life. Kumiko's father reached out and touched the handlebars, finding them still warm from the sun. The pressure of the mystery began to rise, a physical weight that made it hard for them to stay in the clearing. The point of no return was reached that night when the local police arrived with flashlights and search dogs. They combed through the rice paddies in the nearby woods, their beams of light cutting through the darkness like frantic needles. By down, they had found nothing but the empty bicycle and the quiet path. The girl was gone, and the village of Saga was no longer the safe sanctuary it had been the day before. This was only the beginning of a nightmare that would stretch across 14 years. In 1980, a hiker was exploring a remote mountain forest several miles away from the village when he noticed something white protruding from a pile of old leaves. He knelt down and realized he was looking at a set of skeletal remains. He did not touch them. He simply backed away and called the authorities from the nearest phone. The discovery of the remains led to a gruesome realization for the investigators. They found not one, but 3 sets of bones buried in the same general area of the mountain. One of the sets was identified through dental records as Kumiko, the girl who had vanished from her red bicycle 5 years earlier. The other 2 were women in their early 20s who had also been reported missing from the surrounding prefectures. The investigation into the Saga serial cases was a long and agonizing process that exposed the limitations of rural policing in the 1970s and 80s. The crimes were spaced years apart, often with 3 or 4 years of silence between each disappearance. This slow burn rhythm made it difficult for the police to link the cases together until the body count had already reached a critical level. A chilling pattern eventually emerged from the data that the detectives had collected. Every single victim had disappeared on either a Wednesday or a Friday, and always during the daylight hours. The killer did not strike in the middle of the night or under the cover of a storm. He chose the most visible times, picking targets who were alone on the quiet, sun-drenched roads of the countryside. This ritualistic schedule suggested a killer who lived a very structured life, perhaps someone with a job that required him to travel through the prefecture on specific days of the week. He was a low-profile predator who knew the rhythms of the rural community and could move through the villages without drawing any attention to himself. He was someone who looked like he belonged in the landscape. By 1989, the total number of victims had risen to 7 women and girls. The final disappearance involved a 25-year-old office worker who had stepped out for a short walk during her lunch break and never returned. Her body was found months later in a shallow grave near a mountain road, showing the same precise, cold method of disposal that had been seen in the earlier cases. A meaning-shifting clue arrived when a local man was arrested for an unrelated crime and began to talk about the mountain girls to his cellmate. The information reached the detectives, and they focused their attention on a suspect who lived in a small house near the center of the prefecture. He was a quiet man who worked as a delivery driver, a job that allowed him to be on the roads at all hours of the day. The man was brought in for questioning, and while he admitted to being in the areas where the victims disappeared, he denied any involvement in the murders. The physical evidence was thin, as the remains had been exposed to the elements for years before they were discovered. In 1998, the suspect was actually acquitted of the final murder due to a lack of DNA evidence and a confession that was deemed unreliable. The twist in the case was the looming presence of the Japanese statute of limitations for murder. At the time, the law stated that if a killer was not prosecuted within 15 years of the crime, they could never be charged, no matter what evidence was found later. As the clock ticked toward 2005, the families of the victims realized that justice was running out of time. The climax of the saga occurred on the final day of the statute for the 1989 murder. The families gathered at the local police station, hoping for a last-minute breakthrough that would allow the state to file charges. But as the clock struck midnight, the legal window slammed shut forever. The killer, if still alive, was now effectively immune from the law for every one of the 7 murders. The truth revealed during the scene reconstruction was that the killer likely used his vehicle as a mobile trap. He would pull over next to a lone girl on a bicycle or a woman on a walk, offering help or asking for directions in a calm, non-threatening voice. Once the victim was close enough, He would move with a sudden, overwhelming force, pulling them into the car and driving toward the isolated mountain roads. He worked with a level of patience that is rare among serial predators, waiting years between strikes to ensure that the police attention had shifted elsewhere. He did not leave signatures or messages, and he did not engage in the kind of high-risk behavior that leads to a quick arrest. He was a man who understood the value of silence and the power of a landscape that was too large to be fully policed. The killer detail that remains is the upright bicycle. He didn't just grab the girl and run, he took the time to lean her bike against a post, making it look as if she had just stepped away for a moment. This small, tidy action suggests a mind that valued order and wanted to delay the start of a search for as long as possible. It was a clinical, almost polite way to start a tragedy. In 2026, the saga serial kidnappings remain one of Japan's most haunting unsolved mysteries. The case is the primary reason the Japanese government eventually voted to abolish the statute of limitations for murder in 2010. The law was changed too late for Kumiko and the other 6 victims, but their story became the catalyst for a fundamental change in how the country handles its most serious crimes. The rice paddies of Saga still turn a vibrant green every spring, and the red bicycles still travel the dirt paths between the villages. But the silence of the countryside has a different quality now, a weight that reminds the residents of a 14-year shadow. The killer is still a phantom, a man who found a hole in the law and stepped through it, leaving behind only the clicking of a bicycle chain in the wind. 14 years of silence in Japan, but in the humid marshlands of the American South, the silence was just the beginning of a nightmare that would span 3 decades. While the ground in Saga was covered in leaves and salt, the earth in a small patch of Texas was being reshaped by a different kind of monster. In our final case, we look at the spot where the grass grows tall enough to hide 30 separate secrets. On a Tuesday afternoon in 1971, the air over League City was a thick, stagnant soup of Gulf Coast humidity. The tall, yellow saltgrass along Interstate 45 moved in slow, heavy waves as the wind pushed inland from the coast. To a driver heading toward Houston, the landscape looked like a repetitive blur of green and brown, a seemingly endless stretch of unpoliced marshland. Beneath that grass, the earth was soft and black, capable of hiding anything that did not want to be found. Colette Wilson was 13 years old and had spent her morning at band practice, her mind likely filled with the sheet music for an upcoming school concert. She stood on a street corner in the town of Alvin, waiting for a ride that would take her through the final stretch of her ordinary day. She was a girl of habits and schedules, a student who was never late and never strayed far from the path her parents expected her to follow. The sun was hot on her shoulders as she gripped the case of her musical instrument. Just a few weeks later, 14-year-old Brenda Jones was walking toward a hospital to visit her mother. She was a girl who understood the weight of responsibility, moving with a purposeful stride through the humid afternoon air. The streets she traveled were familiar and felt as solid as her own backyard, lined with the modest homes and oak trees of a quiet Texas suburb. She had a plan for the evening and a clear reason to be exactly where she was at that hour of the day. In the early 1970s, the corridor between Houston and Galveston was undergoing a massive and rapid transition. The oil industry was booming, and the highway was a constant river of commuters, truckers, and travelers moving between the big city and the coastal ports. Despite the constant traffic, the land on either side of the pavement remained largely wild and undeveloped. It was a place of high grass, hidden bayous, and dirt roads that led nowhere in particular. The residents of these small towns lived in a world where the primary sound was the distant, constant hum of the interstate. It was a background noise that everyone eventually stopped hearing, a mechanical rhythm that defined the pace of life in the Gulf Coast. People worked hard, looked after their neighbors, and believed that the marshlands were simply a part of the scenery. They did not yet understand that the highway brought with it a different kind of predator. The ride that was supposed to pick Colette up from the corner in Alvin never arrived. Or perhaps it arrived in a form she did not recognize. Her parents waited on their front porch, the minutes ticking past the time she was always through the front door. The street was empty, and the only sound was the wind moving through the trees. They checked with her friends in the school, but the girl who was always on time had simply vanished into the afternoon heat. Brenda never made it to the hospital room where her mother was waiting for her to arrive. She had been seen walking near a busy intersection. A brief flash of a blue dress against the dusty roadside, and then she was gone. Her family spent the entire night calling everyone they knew, their concern growing into a sharp, cold panic as the hours turned into a new day. They searched the places she loved, but the city felt suddenly large and indifferent to their growing fear. The local police departments in the small towns along the highway were not equipped to handle the simultaneous disappearance of two young girls. They viewed the cases as isolated incidents, perhaps the work of runaways seeking the excitement of the city or a trip to the beach. The search efforts were scattered and lacked a central focus, allowing the blind spot of the marshes to remain unexamined. The families felt a crushing weight of silence as the days stretched into weeks. A hiker was moving through a 25-acre patch of wasteland in League City, looking for pieces of driftwood and interesting stones. He pushed through a thick wall of yellow saltgrass and noticed a strange, muddy indentation in the dark earth. As he looked closer, he realized he was not looking at a natural formation or a piece of discarded trash. He found the remains of Colette Wilson, lying in the same marshland that thousands of people drove past every single day. The discovery of the body turned the quiet marsh into a high-intensity crime scene. With officers from multiple jurisdictions converging on the site, they moved through the tall grass with careful, deliberate steps, their boots sinking into the soft mud, just a short distance from the first site. They discovered the remains of Brenda Jones. The realization that two girls had been taken and left in the same patch of grass sent a shockwave through the entire Gulf Coast. Detective Reed was one of the few officers who spent his nights looking at maps of the Interstate 45 corridor, trying to find a pattern in the chaos. He noted that the dump site was almost perfectly positioned to be accessible from the highway, yet completely invisible from the road. He argued that the girls were not runaways, but victims of a single predator who knew the landscape of the marshes intimately. He felt the weight of a tragedy that was only just beginning. The theory was that the killer used a vehicle as his primary weapon, snatching the girls from the roadside and moving them quickly to the isolated fields. He did not need to be a stranger. He could have been anyone with a reason to be on the road, from a delivery driver to a local worker. The investigation focused on the men who frequented the truck stops and the gas stations along the interstate. But in 1971, forensic science was a very blunt tool. The meaning-shifting clue was not a piece of evidence, but a growing tally of names that began to emerge over the following years. More girls disappeared from the towns along the highway, and more bodies were found in that same 25-acre patch of grass. The area earned the name of the Texas Killing Fields, a place where the earth seemed to have a magnetic pull for the lost. The 1971 cases were no longer just a tragedy, they were the genesis. The twist was the realization that the predator had found a perfect dumping ground that remained effective for 3 decades. The high grass and the humid air acted as natural erasers, breaking down evidence and concealing the crimes from the thousands of people passing by. The initial murders established a precedent of impunity that allowed a monster to operate in plain sight. These girls were the first notes in a long, dark symphony of violence that would never end. The climax of the search for the 1971 killer occurred when investigators realized that the initial murders were likely committed by a local. They looked at the men who had been interviewed decades earlier, re-examining their stories with the benefit of hindsight and modern technology. They found a man named Edward Bell, a resident who had been a constant, low-level presence in the criminal records of the area. He was a man who knew the marshes perfectly. The truth revealed during the scene reconstruction suggested that the killer would pull over and offer a ride, his vehicle acting as a temporary cage. He would drive into the dirt tracks that cut through the tall grass, knowing that the noise of the highway would drown out any struggle. He worked with a cold, repetitive precision, disposing of the bodies in a way that ensured they would be swallowed by the mud and the salt grass before they were ever found by the police. The method was built on the exploitation of the girl's trust and the specific geography of the Gulf Coast. He chose the most vulnerable targets at the most ordinary times, turning a walk to a hospital into a final, terrifying journey. He did not leave complicated signatures, relying instead on the absolute isolation of the fields to protect his identity. He was a shadow that moved along the highway, a passenger in the lives of the innocent who took everything. Edward Bell eventually confessed to several of the murders in the killing fields, including those of Colette and Brenda, though he was never officially charged. He spoke of the girls with a chilling lack of emotion, describing the start of his spree as a simple series of choices made in the heat of the afternoon. He was a man who viewed the marshes not as a graveyard, but as a space where he was finally in total and absolute control of the world. The tall grass of League City still sways in the Gulf breeze, and the hum of Interstate 45 remains a constant, low-frequency roar. The 1971 cases are legally unsolved, but the names of Colette Wilson and Brenda Jones are carved into the history of the Texas killing fields. They were the first to go into the grass, and their story remains the foundation of a mystery that defined a generation of law enforcement in the American South. In 2026, forensic genealogists are using advanced DNA sequencing on the smallest fragments of evidence recovered from the 1971 dump sites. They are looking for matches among the descendants of the original suspects, hoping to provide a final, scientific confirmation of the killer's identity. While the men who committed these crimes may be gone, the technology of the future is finally beginning to peel back the layers of the Texas mud. The ground in the killing fields is black and heavy, holding the weight of 30 years of secrets and the memories of 30 lost lives. The story that began with two girls in 1971 is a reminder that some landscapes never truly forget what happened in the tall grass. As the sun sets over the Gulf Coast, the silence of the marshes remains, a heavy aftertaste for a world that is still trying to find its way back to the light. These 10 stories show that the line between an ordinary day and a permanent mystery is far thinner than people want to believe. None of these victims began their day inside a nightmare. They were on flights, roads, beaches, school routes, and family outings. The danger arrived quietly, wearing the shape of routine. A central lesson is that evil rarely announces itself in a dramatic way at first. It often appears calm, polite, competent, or familiar. The most dangerous people in these cases were not obvious monsters in the opening moments. They were men who blended into the setting so well that no one reacted until the point of no return had already passed. These stories also show how much power belongs to place. Storms, forests, salt flats, highways, basements, beaches, and marshes were not passive backgrounds. They helped hide bodies, erase evidence, delay searches, and protect offenders. Geography did not just contain the crime. In many cases, it made the crime possible. Another lesson is that the vulnerable are often the easiest to erase. Migrant workers, children, young women, and people moving alone through ordinary spaces were repeatedly targeted because they were easier to isolate and slower to be fully protected. A predator does not only look for weakness in a person, he looks for weakness in the system surrounding that person. Power shaped many of these cases long after the crimes themselves. In several stories, the truth was distorted by status, politics, class, or influence. Convenient confessions appeared. Investigations narrowed too quickly, and evidence seemed to stop moving once it approached protected names. These cases remind us that truth and power are often in direct conflict. One of the clearest insights is that appearance means very little. A well-dressed passenger, a respected neighbor, an aristocrat, a family friend, or a politically connected young man can still be the center of enormous violence. Surface normality is one of the most effective disguises in human history, and many communities only realize that after it is too late. These stories repeatedly prove that violence is often procedural, not chaotic. Many offenders planned routes, studied environments, selected timing, or exploited specific routines. That is what makes them so disturbing. They were not always acting from visible madness. Often they were calm enough to prepare, wait, and carry out a decision with cold control. Small details mattered in nearly every case. A note on a plane, a hidden mask, a missing bulb, a child's garden tools, an upright bicycle, bundles of money in river sand, a leather-bound address book, a patch of unusual silence. These details were more than atmosphere. They were the thin, surviving edge of truth after someone tried to erase it. A major lesson from all 10 stories is that mystery thrives where procedure fails. Weak school pickup rules, delayed missing person responses, deference to wealth, fragmented policing, and slow recognition of patterns all created openings that offenders could use. The crime begins with the offender, but the scale of the damage often depends on what the system lets him get away with. These cases also reveal how communities lose innocence. After crimes like these, a place never feels fully the same again. A forest becomes a warning, a road becomes haunted, a basement becomes more than architecture. A town that once relied on trust begins relying on locks, suspicion, and inherited caution. Trauma changes geography by changing how people move through it. Another valuable insight is that disappearance creates a special kind of pain. Murder is already unbearable, but uncertainty prolongs the wound. Families and communities keep replaying the final route, the final sighting, the missed sign, the object left behind. An unsolved case traps the living inside unfinished thought, sometimes for decades. Time, however, does not only destroy evidence, it can also change meaning. Old confessions begin to look weak under new scrutiny. New science gives fresh weight to forgotten objects. A clue ignored in one decade becomes central in another. These stories show that truth can remain buried for years without being fully dead. Several cases also expose the role of entitlement. Some offenders seem driven not only by desire or fear, but by the belief that another person's life could be taken, controlled, hidden, or redefined for their own convenience. That mindset appears in domestic violence, sexual predation, political silencing, and elite cover-up alike. The form changes, but the core logic is similar. There is also a strong lesson about social blindness. Societies often protect their self-image before they protect the vulnerable. Safe towns want to believe they are safe. Modern capitals want to believe they are orderly. Elite systems want to believe they are respectable. That denial delays truth, and delay is exactly what predators need. What remains in memory are often not full timelines, but images: a tie on a seat, a nailed rubber mask, a family frozen around a picnic blanket, a silver car in mud, a red bicycle waiting upright by the road, tall grass beside a highway. These images endure because they hold the full weight of a vanished life inside something small and ordinary. Another lesson is that justice depends on people who refuse to look away. A survivor who escapes, a witness who notices something wrong, a detective who questions the easy story, a family that keeps pushing after the case cools. These people prevent total erasure. Even when they cannot solve the mystery, they keep it from becoming pure silence. These stories warn against romanticizing mystery. Some names become legends, but legend can blur the human cost. Behind every famous case is a body, a family, a missed future, and a place permanently altered. The unanswered question may fascinate the public, but the real center of the story is always the person who did not get to come home. Taken together, the 10 stories argue that evil works best when it finds a gap in attention, in procedura, in class accountability, in geography, in political courage, or in collective memory. The offender steps into that gap, and once he does, ordinary life can collapse with terrifying speed. The final lesson is the simplest and heaviest one. Human life is held together by fragile, invisible lines: trust, timing, habit, law, and the belief that the world will remain ordinary for one more hour. These stories show what happens when one of those lines snaps. The silence that follows can last for generations.